Kunduz Hospital errors strike. This is one of the most recent ones in the video, as it happened on October 3rd, 2015. On that day, an American military gunship attacked a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. This was not a military base. It was a trauma center run by the famous aid group Doctors Without Borders. For about 30 minutes, the aircraft circled overhead, firing repeatedly and precisely at the hospital buildings. The gunship fired 211 shells in total. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. Some patients burned alive in their beds because they could not move. Doctors lost their limbs or were decapitated by shrapnel while trying to operate. As people tried to run from the burning buildings to escape, they were shot from the air. By the time the attack ended, at least 42 people were dead, including doctors, nurses, and patients. The hospital had given its exact GPS coordinates to the U.S. military just days before, specifically to prevent something like this from happening. Even while the bombs were falling, hospital staff were frantically calling military officials, begging them to stop. But the strikes' music continued. After the attack, the American explanation changed several times. First, officials said they were protecting troops on the ground. Then they claimed the Afghan army had asked for the strike. Finally, the U.S. commander admitted it was a specific decision made by American forces, but called it a tragic mistake caused by human error and broken equipment. Some officials tried to claim that Taliban fighters were hiding in the hospital, using civilians as human shields. Doctors Without Borders flatly denied this, explaining that they had a strict no-weapons policy and that the compound was full of doctors and patients, not soldiers. In the end, President Obama apologized and the military punished 16 people with administrative discipline, but no one was ever charged with a crime. The Pentagon concluded that because it was an accident, it was not a war crime. The doctors and the United Nations called for an independent investigation, arguing that a military cannot fairly investigate its own actions. But that investigation never happened. Mahmoudiya killings. On March 12, 2006, in a small house near the village of Yusfa in Iraq, something truly horrific happened. 5 American soldiers from the 5,002nd Infantry Regiment left their checkpoint and walked to the home of an Iraqi family. The family included a 14-year-old girl called Air and her 6-year-old sister, Hadal, and their parents. Their 2 younger brothers were away at school that day. These soldiers had been watching Abir from their nearby checkpoint for some time. They often saw her doing chores in the garden, and some had harassed her before, staring at her or making gestures that scared her family. Her mother had even planned to have Abir sleep at a relative's house to keep her safe. One soldier, Stephen Dale Green, had even touched Abir's face during a house search, which terrified her. Green himself had told a reporter just a month earlier that killing people in Iraq felt like nothing to him, like squashing an ant, and that he had come there wanting to kill. That day, the soldiers were drinking alcohol mixed with energy drinks, playing cards, and talking about doing what can't be said here to Abir and killing Iraqis. Green kept pushing the idea. 4 of them changed their looks to look less like U.S. soldiers, and they headed to the house in broad daylight. Brian L. Howard stayed at the checkpoint, but knew what was planned. They separated the family into different rooms. One of them grabbed the little sister who was outside, while another one shot and killed the parents and the sister. The mother struggled and her arms were broken. Then 2 soldiers took turns doing what they had planned to Abir. The soldier who shot the family came in after killing the others, said he had just killed them all, and called it awesome. He then did the same thing as the other 2 soldiers to Abir and then killed her. To cover it up, they poured petrol on her body and set fire to the lower part. The fire spread and they burned their bloody clothes too, throwing the murder weapon into a canal. Afterwards, they went back and ate chicken wings to celebrate. Neighbors saw the smoke and rushed over. One described seeing the poor girl's body. They told Air's uncle, who put out some flames to get inside, and saw the terrible scene. The surviving brothers, 9-year-old Ahmed and 11-year-old Muhammad, came home from school to find their house burning and their family gone. They were left, orphans raised by their uncle. The soldiers tried to blame Sunni insurgents at first, and for a while, no one investigated deeply, but the crime led to revenge attacks. Militant groups claimed they kidnapped and killed American soldiers from the same unit to avenge a beer, releasing videos of the bodies. The truth came out months later when another soldier in the unit, Justin Watt, heard about it from others and decided to report it, even though he feared his comrades might hurt him for speaking up. Investigations started and the soldiers were arrested. Green had already left the army for mental issues, so he was tried in a civilian court. He was found guilty of rape and murder, but got life in prison instead of death because the jury could not agree on the death penalty. He later died in prison by side. The others faced military trials. Barker pleaded guilty, admitted hating Iraqis, and got 90 years with possible parole after 10. Cortez also pleaded guilty, apologized in tears for the pain he caused, and got 100 years, with possible parole after 10. Spielman was convicted and sentenced to 110 years with possible parole after 10. Howard, who helped cover it up, got 27 months. Another soldier who knew but did not report was discharged. Connecticut Massacre. American troops had just entered the town of Kankakee in Sicily. The German army had retreated, leaving behind a lot of destruction. So desperate and hungry, local people gathered at a bombed-out factory to take whatever supplies they could find. They were filling buckets with food and liquid soap just to survive the chaos. An American commander named Colonel McCaffrey arrived at the scene. He was supposed to be in charge of keeping order. Instead, when he saw the crowd, he demanded they leave immediately. When the people didn't move fast enough, the colonel ordered his own soldiers to fire into the crowd of unarmed families. But the soldiers refused to shoot as they saw that these were just civilians. Furious, Colonel McCaffrey pulled out his own handgun and started shooting people himself. He killed at least 8 innocent people, including an 11-year-old girl. The most shocking part is that the colonel got away with it. He was never punished and lived for another decade before dying of natural causes. For years, this massacre was completely forgotten, and the truth only came out because the son of a witness finally decided to tell the world what he had seen. Tiger Force atrocities. The Tiger Force started as a small group of elite soldiers in Vietnam, trained to be fast and deadly. But by May 1967, this unit had turned into something monstrous. The mission was supposed to be about finding guerrilla fighters, but it became something totally different. The commanders wanted high numbers of enemy kills, and one colonel even ordered the troops to reach a specific number of kills to match the unit's name. This created an environment where soldiers felt like they had a license to kill anyone they saw. For 7 months, they went on a rampage where unarmed people were hunted down and killed, even if they weren't guerrilla fighters. The reports from that time describe a nightmare. Soldiers were executing elderly people and women in the rice fields as they begged for their lives. They threw grenades into underground shelters where families were hiding, turning those bunkers into mass graves. Prisoners were tortured and executed routinely. Some soldiers began cutting off the ears of the dead and wearing them on necklaces as trophies. 2 friends from Arizona, Sammy Barr and Ken Green, became the symbols of all of this. After Green was killed in battle, Ibero went over the edge and started mutilating bodies. Instead of being punished, Ibero was actually congratulated in a military newspaper for getting the unit's 1,000th kill. Not everyone went along with what was happening, though. A soldier named Gerald Brunner actually pointed his rifle at a fellow soldier to stop a killing, but his commanders treated him like he was the problem. Others who tried to report the crimes were told to keep quiet. One military journalist was threatened with death by his own commander if he spoke up. Even the medical staff suspected what was happening but were too afraid to investigate. Years later, though, the Army actually did investigate. From 1971 to 1975, they gathered sworn statements from soldiers who admitted to the crimes. They found proof of routine murder, including the killing of 2 blind brothers and many music civilians. However, in the end, nobody was punished. Some think it was because by 1975, the war was ending and the government wanted to move on. Likely afraid of a massive scandal, the files were buried. It took decades for reporters to uncover the truth. They went back to Vietnam, found the old grave sites, and spoke to witnesses. Al-Hamdaniya murder. On April 26, 2006, a group of U.S. Marines went into a small village in Iraq called Al-Hamdaniya, not to fight, but to look for an insurgent. However, when they couldn't find him, they made a decision to just get someone else. There was someone called by the locals as Hashim Lam, a disabled man who walked with a metal bar in his leg and had poor eyesight. The Marines broke into his house while he was asleep and dragged him away from his family. Before they grabbed him, they stole a shovel and an AK-47 from a neighbor's yard to use as props. Music. They tied the disabled man's hands, forced him to walk to a hole in the road, and shot him to death. To cover their tracks, they fired the stolen gun into the air to make it sound like a battle was happening. Then they untied his hands, planted the shovel and the rifle next to his body, and filed a false report claiming they had shot a terrorist who was digging a roadside bomb. When his family found him the next morning, he had been shot in the mouth and his face was so swollen and beaten that he was almost unrecognizable. The truth eventually came out, and 7 Marines and 1 Navy medic were charged with murder and kidnapping. However, the justice system struggled to hold them accountable. Most of the men made deals to testify against each other in exchange for lighter punishments. The leader of the group was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years, but that conviction was later overturned due to legal errors. He was retried and convicted again, but in the end, the jury decided he didn't need to serve any more prison time. Gorla Massacre. On October 20th, 1944, children at an elementary school in Milan were running down the stairs toward the air raid shelter while bombs were being dropped on the city when a sudden explosion caused a tragedy. At the time, Milan was heavily bombed because it was one of Italy's most important industrial cities, music, and its factories were useful for supporting the war. The 451st Bombing Group of the 15th Air Force was assigned to bomb Milan, even though it was known to have a poor record since earlier in the war planes from the same group had accidentally bombed the town of Vinafro, killing 40 Italian civilians and 17 Allied soldiers. Although they were investigated and criticized, no officers were punished because commanders feared it would hurt morale in future operations. Nonetheless, on the morning of October 20th, 1944, 111 American bombers took off from southern Italy. 2 bomber groups hit their assigned targets, and then music, was the 451st Bombing Group's turn. They were supposed to strike the Brea factory. The lead aircraft made a fatal navigation mistake. Instead of turning left toward the target, it turned right, sending the bombers directly over the densely populated neighborhoods of Gora and Peccato. Realizing they could no longer reach the factory, the lead plane still dropped its bombs and ordered the others to do the same. All the bombs from the second wave fell on civilian areas. This attack, later known as the Gorla Massacre, killed about 614 civilians. Among the dead were 184 children who were inside the Francesco Crispi Primary School when the bombs, music, hit. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but many people didn't have enough time to reach shelters. After the bombing, there was internal criticism of the 451st Bombing Group, but there were no real consequences. No one was punished, and Milan was devastated. The children came to be known as the Little Martyrs of Gora. Fascist authorities used the bombing for propaganda, calling the Allies murderers of children. Thubo killings. On January 31st, Company H of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines approached the small village of Twibo at midday. Suddenly, they came under heavy fire, including from a .050 caliber machine gun. Pinned down, their captain, Edward Banks, called in airstrikes and artillery, and asked for reinforcements. Even with help, though, they could not advance and stayed under fire until nightfall. At first light the next morning, the company pushed into the village. What happened next is where the story split apart. Vietnamese communist sources say it was a massacre, and a village memorial lists 145 civilians killed, mostly women, children, and elderly men. U.S. sources, on the other hand, say 22 civilians died during 2 days of combat. The Marines reported 5 dead and 26 wounded in their own ranks, an estimated 101 Viet Cong killed. Captain Banks said it was impossible to tell who was enemy and who was friend. He claimed villagers sometimes watched booby traps go off without warning Marines. Overall, he described the mission as a search and destroy operation and denied a massacre. He insisted the Viet Cong used human shields and argued that at most 10 to 15 civilians may have been killed during the assault. He said he shouted for his men to stop firing when the enemy's fire ended. Some of his men, though, remembered things differently. Marine Jack Hill said the number of dead was ridiculous for a village they had thought was friendly. He said that the next day their orders were to sweep the village. Hill described forcing people from hiding by throwing grenades into bunkers. He explained that the language barrier and the pressure of war had a role in those choices. Villagers told yet other versions. A 14-year-old, Music, said jets and artillery struck first. Then troops came, asked if people were Viet Cong, and shot them. Others said only women, children, and old men were present, and that short bursts of gunfire cut them down while they ate or pressed sugarcane. One woman said a grenade thrown into her house killed 10 family members, and that soldiers fired again into the corpses. Another said that a neighbor who had just given birth was killed, and her baby too, in a brutal way. One villager said babies clung to dead mothers' bodies when the shooting stopped, and that the living carried corpses to nearby posts to demand the killing end. Some said Marines later ordered them to dig up buried bodies to look for Viet Cong. When asked about claims that women and children were forced into a shelter and a grenade thrown inside, Hill said he could not confirm it. He described mass confusion and crying. The Marines battalion reviewed the 22 corpses and 18 wounded people brought to their command post and called Music these deaths an unfortunate side effect of the battle. Villagers insisted many were executed at close range after the Viet Cong had already left. The numbers remain disputed. Biscari Massacre. On July 14, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, American soldiers in 2 separate incidents on the same day executed 73 prisoners of war. In the first incident, a sergeant named Horace West was ordered to take a group of prisoners to the rear. Instead, he marched them about a mile away and stopped. Music. He borrowed a Tommy gun and told his fellow American guards to turn away if they did not want to watch what he was about to do. He then opened fire on the unarmed men. Investigators later found that he had shot them through the heart. The most chilling detail is that after his gun ran empty, West reloaded it and walked among the bodies, shooting the wounded men who were still moving to make sure they were dead. 37 bodies were left lying on the ground. Later that same day, a captain named John Compton was angry because snipers had been shooting at his men. When his troops captured a group of 36 Italians who were hiding in a ditch, they brought them to the captain. The prisoners begged for their lives, but the captain gave a direct order to a firing squad. He told his men he did not want anyone left standing. When the prisoners tried to run, the Americans opened fire and killed all of them. When the news reached the top commanders at first, the famous General George Patton tried to cover it up. He wrote in his diary that they should just lie and say the men were snipers killed in combat to avoid a scandal. However, other officers refused to stay silent, and Patton himself. Once he learned the details that the prisoners had offered no provocation and were essentially being slaughtered, said, "Try those bastards." Both the sergeant and the captain were put on trial. The sergeant was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, while the captain was found not guilty, claiming he was just following orders. Soldiers claimed that those orders came from Patton himself, who, according to their version, said not to take prisoners if enemy combatants continued to resist within 200 yards of their position. The story has a shocking ending. The sergeant never actually served his life sentence. After the noise died down, the army quietly released him a year later. He was allowed to return to duty and was eventually given an honorable discharge. Music, torture, and Operation Tear-Up. It was the final weeks of World War II, and a terrifying rumor was spreading through the U.S. military. Leaders believed that German submarines were crossing the Atlantic carrying flying bombs or rockets aimed directly at New York City. The mayor of New York had even warned the public that attacks were coming. In response, the U.S. Navy launched a massive mission called Operation Teardrop to hunt down these boats before they could reach the coast. The fighting in the North Atlantic was brutal. During the battle, a German submarine named U-546 managed to sink an American destroyer, killing most of the crew. The Americans responded with fury, hunting the German boat for 10 hours until they forced it to the surface and sank it. They pulled 33 German survivors from the water, including the captain, Paul Just. However, instead of treating them like normal prisoners of war, the Americans were driven by panic. They needed to know if more submarines were coming with missiles. They separated 8 specific crew members, labeled them as specialists, and took them to a base in Newfoundland. There, the interrogators used what they called shock interrogation. They threw the men into solitary confinement, beat them, and forced them to do exhausting physical exercises until they broke. The treatment was so harsh that the German captain eventually collapsed unconscious. This torture continued even after the war in Europe had officially ended. Historians later desk.